The Meridian Collective prided itself on being the pinnacle of galactic civilization. 15 species, all elegantly evolved on garden worlds where the most dangerous predator was something fluffy that ate berries, had come together to form an alliance of mutual sophistication. They had art galleries that floated in zero-gravity philosophy departments that could argue about the nature of consciousness for 3 centuries straight. And most importantly, they had the Exchange Academy program. The program was the jewel in their bureaucratic crown. Every cycle, the most promising youth from member worlds would gather at the Celestial Athenaeum, a space station roughly the size of a small moon, to learn from each other and prove that, yes, different species absolutely could share classroom space without anyone getting eaten. It was very progressive. They even had a charter about it written in 17 languages, none of which anyone had actually read. Past page 3. The administration particularly enjoyed accepting students from what they diplomatically termed developing worlds, planets that had just figured out faster than light travel, whose inhabitants still did quaint things like breathe oxygen-nitrogen atmospheres and experience linear time. It made the collective feel magnanimous, like they were uplifting the unfortunate, rather than just filling diversity quotas, which brought them to Earth. Earth had submitted an application 30 cycles ago, been rejected 29 times for reasons ranging from insufficient technological sophistication to concerning tendency toward self-destructive behavior to one memorable instance of we read their internet and need therapy now, but the collective had quotas to meet, and Earth's 30th application had arrived during a particularly slow administrative period when someone in admissions had been desperate enough to actually approve it. That someone had since transferred to a different department, possibly a different galaxy. The human they sent was named Kira Vance, which already violated several collective naming conventions by being pronounceable in less than 4 octaves. She was female by human standards, 20 Earth years old, and according to her file had grown up in a place called Arizona, which the translation matrix kept trying to render as desolation of fire where hope goes to die. The translation matrix needed maintenance, obviously. Kira had been at the Athenaeum for approximately 2 standard months when the Thornweave trio decided she needed to disappear. The trio consisted of Zal Tef, whose species had evolved on a moon with 0.6 standard gravity and considered room temperature to be a balmy 15 degrees C. There was Quinella, whose people breathed methane and found oxygen to be roughly as pleasant as humans found chlorine gas. And finally, there was Wrath, who came from a high-pressure world and thought anything above sea level was dangerously thin atmosphere. Together, they represented the best and brightest of their respective species, which really said something about the state of galactic education. Their grudge against Kira was complex and multifaceted, which is to say, completely stupid. She had corrected Zal Tef advanced astrophysics, not rudely, not even smugly, just a quiet, I think you meant gravitational constant, not cosmological constant, that had somehow snowballed into a vendetta that would make Shakespeare reach for stronger adjectives. The thing about students from advanced civilizations was that they had never really experienced consequences. Their worlds were safe, regulated, and blessed with the kind of administrative oversight that prevented anyone from learning that actions had results. So when Zoltek proposed over-fermented fungus in the recreational quadrant, that they simply eliminate the human problem, the other two nodded along as if this was a reasonable solution to academic embarrassment. They began planning with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that they definitely did not apply to their actual studies. Research was conducted. The collective's databases had files on Earth, though calling them comprehensive would be like calling a supernova slightly warm. The files mentioned that Earth was a Class M planet, which could mean anything from pleasant garden world to actively trying to kill you, depending on about 40 other factors that the database designers had considered. Optional information. Gravity. One standard unit. That seemed fine. The researchers who compiled the data had failed to mention that standard was based on Earth measurements, because humans had been annoyingly successful at making first contact, and their units had somehow become the default. Most collective species experienced Earth gravity the way humans might experience being slowly crushed under a refrigerator. Atmosphere. Oxygen-nitrogen mix. The file listed this as breathable, which was technically true in the same way that a bonfire is technically warm. The oxygen percentage on Earth was high, enough to be mildly toxic to most species over extended periods, causing something akin to very slow combustive damage at the cellular level. Climate variable. This was the most useless descriptor in galactic history. Variable covered everything from pleasant seasonal changes to the sky regularly tries to murder everyone with rotating columns of air. Native fauna. Present. The file included a picture of something called a golden retriever, which looked harmless and fluffy. Cross-referencing did not reveal information about creatures called hippopotamuses or box jellyfish or mosquitoes, or any of the other delightful ways Earth had evolved to end biological processes. The Thornweave trio looked at this data and concluded that Kira Vance was just another fragile biological organism from an unremarkable rock. They did not consider that perhaps a species that had clawed its way to space flight from such a planet might have certain advantages. This was their first mistake. It would not be their last, but it was certainly the most fundamental. The plan they concocted was elegant. Its simplicity, which meant it was actually quite stupid, but they had convinced themselves otherwise. Stage 1 involved contaminating Kira's food with a compound that was lethal to most carbon-based life forms. The compound in question was capsaicin, which they had acquired from the station's xenobiology lab, where it was stored as a Class 4 toxin. Capsaicin was, of course, what humans casually referred to as hot pepper extract. Kira's file, had they read beyond the first page, would have mentioned she was from a place where people engaged in competitive capsaicin consumption for entertainment. They introduced it into her meal during third cycle dining. The cafeteria, designed to accommodate 15 different metabolic systems, was already a symphony of controlled chaos. Getting to her food dispenser was trivially easy. Kira sat down with her tray, which contained something the food synthesizer optimistically called protein matrix with terrestrial vegetables. She took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, took another bite. From across the dining area, the Thornweave trio watched with anticipation that slowly curdled into confusion. Kira reached for her water and they tensed. This was it. The toxin would hit her system, she would collapse, and they would express appropriate shock and sadness while medical services arrived too late. She took a sip of water, set it down, continued eating. Zaltef's sensory stalks drooped. Perhaps the dosage was insufficient. I put in enough to kill a Ripthian. Battle ox. Quinla hissed through her respirator. She should be convulsing. Kira finished her meal, deposited her tray, and walked away, looking perhaps slightly more pleased than usual. Later, she would message her family that the food on the station was finally getting better, and someone had figured out how to add actual flavor. Stage 2 was deployed 3 days later with increased desperation. If toxins would not work, they would try atmospheric modification. Reth, whose people had some proficiency with environmental systems, managed to hack into the ventilation controls for Kira's quarters. The plan was to slowly decrease oxygen levels while increasing carbon dioxide. Not enough to trigger safety alarms, but enough to suffocate a human over the course of several hours. It was supposed to look like a tragic malfunction. Kira woke up the next morning feeling like she had slept particularly well. The air in her room reminded her of camping at high altitude in the Rockies. That thin, crisp quality that made everything seem sharper. She did her morning workout, which consisted of push-ups and sit-ups. That would have hospitalized most species on the station, and headed to class feeling refreshed. The Thornweave trio could not understand it. They had reduced oxygen to levels that should have rendered her unconscious at minimum. They had failed to account for the fact that humans evolved persistence hunting on the African savanna, developing the ability to function in varied altitudes and oxygen levels that would leave other species gasping. Kira's body had simply shrugged, adjusted her breathing rate, and carried on like this was a mild inconvenience rather than attempted murder. Stage 3 was where things got properly unhinged. Temperature manipulation. Zaltef was convinced this would work because his own species was exquisitely sensitive to thermal variation. A change of 5 degrees could send them into torpor. Surely humans were similar. They hacked the environmental controls, again this time cranking the temperature in Kira's quarters up to 38 degrees. C. While she slept, the goal was heatstroke, organ failure, the usual consequences of hypothermia. Kira woke up sweating and mildly annoyed. It felt like summer in Phoenix, which was to say unpleasant but familiar. She complained to maintenance about the climate control being wonky, took a cold shower, and went about her day. That night they tried the opposite. Dropped the temperature to near freezing, assuming that would certainly do the trick. Kira woke up, muttered something unflattering about the heating system, pulled her blanket tighter, and went back to sleep. In the morning she filed a more strongly worded maintenance request and wore a hoodie to class. The Thornweave trio was approaching. Panic. They had thrown toxins, atmospheric manipulation, and temperature extremes at this human, and she had responded with what could generously be called mild irritation. Quinla proposed direct physical confrontation. This was immediately recognized as a terrible idea, but desperation had eroded their judgment to the point where terrible idea seemed reasonable. The attack occurred in one of the less monitored corridors between the xenobiology labs and the living quarters. All three of them, coordinated timing, overwhelming force. Zaltef had even brought a neural disruptor, which was extremely illegal on the station, but he was well past caring about regulations. Kira was walking back from advanced particle theory, thinking about the homework assignment and whether the station's commissary had managed to stock anything resembling actual coffee, when three aliens stepped out of a side passage and blocked her path. She stopped, assessed the situation, sighed. Seriously, she said, look, if this is about the astrophysics thing, I already apologized. Zaltef raised the neural disruptor with appendages that trembled slightly. You have been selected for removal. Human, your presence is not welcome. Kira looked at the device. Her species had survived 2 world wars, multiple genocides, and had invented nuclear weapons before achieving peaceful global governance. She knew what a weapon looked like, even an alien one. You really want to do this? She asked, her voice taking on a quality that her instructors would have recognized as the tone she used right before completely dismantling someone's thesis argument. Reth, attempting to be intimidating, inflated his thoracic cavity to display dominance. In his species, this made predators back down. Kira was not a predator from his world. She was a predator from Earth, where the apex species had climbed to the top through a combination of endurance, tool use, and spite. What happened next would later be described in security reports as the incident, and would require 3 different xenopsychologists to properly document. Zaltef fired the neural disruptor. The beam hit Kira square in the chest, with enough energy to shut down the nervous system of any known species in the collective. Kira stumbled back a step, looked down at her chest, looked back up at Zaltef. Did you just shoot me? Her voice was very calm. This was not a good sign. The neural disruptor, designed for species with distributed nervous systems and electrical synaptic responses, significantly different from human neurology, had essentially given her the equivalent of a strong static shock. Unpleasant, certainly. Incapacitating, not even slightly. Zaltef, realizing the device had failed, made the choice that sealed his fate. He charged, human reflexes honed by millennia of avoiding things with fangs and claws are significantly faster than those of species who evolved on worlds where the most dangerous thing was occasionally falling off a low branch. Kira's hand shot out, caught Zaltef's forward appendage, and the basic laws of physics took over. Human muscle density is approximately 40% higher than the galactic average. Human bone strength is designed to withstand 1 standard gravity, which, again, most species experience as crush level force. When Kira pulled, Zaltef did not resist so much as immediately yield to what his body interpreted as irresistible force. He hit the corridor wall with a sound that his species would later describe as unpleasant crunching. Quinla, operating on pure panic, lunged with a blade designed for ceremonial purposes but sharp enough to be dangerous. Kira caught her wrist, twisted in a way that her high school self-defense class had taught her, and Quinla discovered that human joints bent in directions that seemed mechanically impossible. The blade clattered to the floor. Quinla followed shortly after her, methane respirator askew and her appendages tangled in ways that suggested she was rethinking several life choices. Reth, displaying the survival instinct his species was supposedly famous for, turned and ran. He made it approximately 15 m before Kira's hand clamped down on his shoulder with a grip strength that his people usually associated with industrial machinery. She spun him around and he found himself staring into the eyes of a species that had never evolved prey responses because they had never needed them. "We're going to security," Kira said, her voice still eerily calm. "And you're going to explain why you thought ambushing me was a good idea." Reth, whose species communicated emotional states through chromatic shifts in their dermal layers, turned a color that roughly translated to existential terror in 17 languages. The walk to security was quiet except for Zaltef's whimpering and Quinla's muttered prayers to deities that she had never actually believed in until roughly 5 minutes ago. Station security, staffed by professional peacekeepers from the Collective's Enforcement Division, took one look at the scene and immediately escalated to their supervisor. The supervisor took one look and escalated to the station commander. The commander took one look and seriously considered early retirement. The investigation that followed was thorough, bureaucratic, and increasingly horrified as the full scope of Earth's biological reality became apparent. A xenobiologist named Vilnora was brought in to assess why the assassination attempts had failed so spectacularly. Vilnora had 3 doctoral degrees and had published extensively on comparative physiology. She was about to get an education that our universities had not prepared her for. "Let me understand this correctly," she said, reviewing the data on her hollow display. "Capsaicin is recreational to humans." Kira, sitting in a station security office and nursing what the medical team had confirmed was just a mild bruise from the neural disruptor, nodded. "I mean, some people don't like spicy food, but yeah, it's pretty common. There are competitions and everything." Felnora made a note that trembled slightly. "And the atmospheric modifications. Oxygen reduction to 70% standard. This did not affect you." I felt a little winded, maybe. Like being in Denver. Denver city at high altitude, mile above sea level roughly. Felnora's sensory organs flattened against her head. "Your species regularly inhabits areas with reduced oxygen as a lifestyle." Joyce, "Well, yeah. People live in mountains, some people climb them for fun." The xenobiologist pulled up Earth's atmospheric data, cross-referenced it with evolutionary biology, made several more notes that would later form the basis of a paper titled "Death World Physiology, a Case Study in Evolutionary Masochism. The Temperature Variations." Felnora continued, her voice slightly strained. 38 degrees C below freezing. These are within your comfort range. I wouldn't call them comfortable, but they're survivable. Humans live in deserts that hit 50 degrees. We have settlements in places where it drops to -40. It's not pleasant, but we manage. Fellnera pulled up Earth's climate data, discovered weather phenomena called hurricanes and tornadoes and blizzards, found references to something called Australia, where apparently everything was evolved, specifically to kill you and people. Lived there anyway. Discovered that Earth's sun occasionally threw fits that would sterilize most. Garden worlds and humans just called it solar weather and compensated with technology. She excused herself and spent several minutes in a refresher station, contemplating career changes. The Thornweave trio, meanwhile, was being held in separate detention cells while the administration decided what to do with them. Attempted murder was certainly a serious charge, but the bureaucracy of the collective was discovering a problem. How did you prosecute someone for trying to kill an individual when your entire legal framework assumed that certain environmental conditions were inherently lethal? The trial, when it finally convened, was less a legal proceeding and more a collective nervous breakdown with official documentation. The evidence was presented. The Thornweave trio's plan was laid out in excruciating detail. Character witnesses testified that yes, they had really thought this would work. Expert witnesses explained why it absolutely should have worked on any reasonable species. Then Kira took the stand. The defense attorney, a collective appointed advocate who was beginning to regret passing the bar exam, tried to establish that perhaps Kira had used illegal augmentation or genetic modification to survive the attempt. Are you enhanced in any way? The attorney asked. I mean, I had braces when I was 14, if that counts. Braces. Orthodontic correction. My teeth were crooked. The attorney made a note. Decided that was probably not relevant. But no combat augmentation, no genetic engineering for survival. No, I'm pretty standard for a human. Maybe a little fitter than average. Because I run. But nothing special. This answer caused a ripple through the courtroom. If Kira was standard, that implied that all humans were like this. The implications were staggering and uncomfortable. The prosecution called an expert witness on Earth biology. The witness, who had spent the last week in deep research and deeper drinking, presented findings that would later be classified as potentially psychologically damaging to sensitive species. Earth, it turned out, was not just a difficult world. It was a nightmare factory that had somehow produced a spacefaring civilization. The gravity was crushing by collective standards. The oxygen was toxic in the long term. The temperature swings were extreme. The weather was actively hostile. The native fauna included creatures that could kill humans, and humans had survived anyway through sheer stubborn refusal to go extinct. There were predators on Earth with bite forces that could crush bone. Humans had domesticated some of them and called them pets. There were environmental toxins that could kill most species in minutes. Humans had adapted and built immunity, or just avoided them and went about their day. There were diseases on Earth that would be classified as apocalyptic plagues on any garden world. Humans had developed immune systems that fought them off as a matter of routine, and when that failed, had invented medicine sophisticated enough to punch disease in the face until it gave up. The expert witness showed footage of human athletic competitions, watching humans run for hours, lift weights that should have crushed their skeletal structure, and engage in combat sports for entertainment. Caused several members of the jury to request medical attention. Someone mentioned that humans had survived their own self-inflicted nuclear near-apocalypse and were currently working on not doing that again, which showed remarkable growth and also terrifying resilience. The verdict was never really in doubt. The Thornweave trio was found guilty of attempted murder, conspiracy, and criminal stupidity, though that last one was not technically a legal category, but the judge added it anyway. They were sentenced to academic probation, mandatory xenopsychology, counseling, and a formal written apology to Kira. They were also required to attend a semester-long seminar on death world biology, which their counselors assured them would be very educational. The broader consequences rippled through the Athenaeum like a shockwave through atmosphere. Humans were reclassified, not officially, because that would require admitting that the collective's initial assessment had been catastrophically wrong. But functionally, Kira went from primitive scholarship case to survivor of Hell World in the span of one new cycle. Students gave her a wide berth in corridors, not obviously because that would be rude, but there was suddenly always space around her in crowded areas. Lab partners became very polite. Study groups invited her with a kind of careful courtesy usually reserved for visiting dignitaries or active explosives. One of her classmates, Avril named Tinsha, who had always been friendly, approached her in the commons area after the trial. "I read about your world," Tinsha said, her vocal membrane quivering. "You have insects that drink blood. Mosquitoes, yeah, they're annoying." Annoying. Tinsha repeated the word like she was tasting poison. "On my world, anything that drinks blood is classified as an apex predator, and we evacuate regions where they appear. I mean, they're tiny. You just swat them. You engage in physical combat with blood-drinking predators. I wouldn't call it combat, they're really small." This conversation was repeated in various forms across the station as students discovered the reality of Earth. It became something of a morbid fascination. And GT clears throat. And GT, the human who walked through conditions that would kill them, ate toxins for enjoyment and considered atmospheric catastrophes to be weather. Kira's social status underwent a transformation that anthropologists would later study as an example snorts of reputation dynamics in cross-species environments. She went from being dismissed to being feared, which was not actually an improvement, but was at least different. She tried to normalize things, explained that Earth really was not that bad once you got used to it, mentioned that humans were actually pretty fragile compared to some of their own planet's fauna. This did not help. If anything, it made things worse, because it implied that there were things on Earth more dangerous than humans, and humans had survived anyway. Someone started a rumor that Kira had killed a predator with her bare hands back on Earth. The rumor was false. But Kira had once hit a coyote with her car on a desert highway, which was close enough that she did not bother correcting it. The cafeteria started stocking human-compatible spices, which meant capsaicin in various forms. Other students watched in horrified fascination as Kira casually added what was labeled as a Class 4 toxin to her food and ate it with evident enjoyment. An enterprising Zalthari student started a betting pool on what Earth survival feat Kira would casually mention next. The pot grew substantially when she offhandedly mentioned that humans used to hunt megafauna to extinction using nothing but pointy sticks and patience. The administration, meanwhile, was dealing with a different problem. They had accepted a human student. Earth had more humans. Earth was applying for full collective membership. The implications were cascading through bureaucratic channels like a virus through an unvaccinated population. A committee was formed to assess Earth's application. The committee spent 3 weeks reviewing data and then submitted a report that essentially said, "We don't know what to do with this," in very formal language. Earth was dangerous. Humans were dangerous, not through malice but through simple biology. They were durable, adaptable, and had survival instincts honed by a world that actively tried to kill them. Integrating them into the collective would require rethinking safety standards, environmental regulations, and possibly the definition of civilization. On the other hand, humans had developed space flight, maintained a relatively stable global government after several false starts, and had not immediately tried to conquer anyone upon achieving FTL travel. These were all points in their favor. The committee's recommendation was cautious acceptance with extensive safety protocols and maybe some counseling for existing collective members who might be traumatized by human dietary habits. Back on the Athenaeum, Kira was studying for finals and trying to figure out how to handle her newfound reputation as the station's resident death world survivor. She sat in the library, surrounded by data pads and feeling the familiar pressure of academic stress. Zolteth walked past, saw her, and immediately took a different route to his study. Carol. He was still in a medical brace from where she had thrown him into the wall, and his posture suggested he was rethinking several life choices. Quinla had transferred to a different station entirely. Rath had become very interested in human culture as a coping mechanism and had started a research paper on Earth's evolutionary biology. His therapist said it was progress. Tinsha, who had gotten over her initial fear through sheer determination to understand xenobiology, sat down across from Kira. "Question," she said. "Answer," Kira replied, not looking up from her notes on quantum field theory. "Is it true that humans evolved from predators?" "Sort of. We evolved from omnivores who did a lot of persistence hunting. We would chase prey until it collapsed from exhaustion." Tinsha's chromatic plates shifted to a color indicating deep thought mixed with horror. "That is a predator strategy, I guess. We also gathered plants and invented agriculture after establishing dominance through exhaustion-based hunting. When you say it like that, it sounds worse than it is." Tinsha made a notation on her data pad. She was writing a paper on human evolution for her xenobiology class and was discovering that every answer raised More disturbing questions. Finals came and went. Kira passed all her classes with marks that were good but not exceptional, which was exactly what she had been aiming for. Standing out academically was one thing. Being the human who survived assassination attempts and also topped every class would have made her even more of a curiosity, and she was tired of being stared at. The semester ended. Students dispersed to their home worlds. For the break cycle, Kira caught a transport back to Earth, looking forward to normal gravity, breathable air that would not make other species panic, and food with actual flavor. She arrived at the spaceport in Arizona to find her family waiting. Her mother hugged her with the kind of force that would have hospitalized most collective species. Her father asked how school was going. Her younger brother wanted to know if she had made any friends. "It's been interesting," Kira said, which was the understatement of the century. "But how did you explain to your family that you had accidentally become a symbol of human durability by surviving what other species considered unsurvivable?" They drove home through the desert, past landscapes that collective species would classify as uninhabitable death zones. The sun beat down with radiation that would require serious shielding on most worlds. The temperature hovered around 40 degrees C. A dust devil spun across the highway, which was just wind being dramatic. Kira looked out the window at the familiar scenery and felt something settle in her chest. This was home. This was normal. The fact that it would kill most galactic species was not her problem. Back on the Athenaeum, administrators were preparing for the next semester and the arrival of 3 more human students. They had read the reports. They had implemented new safety protocols. They had hired counselors specializing in death world integration. They were as prepared as they could be, which was to say not very. The collective was about to learn what humanity had always known. Survival is not about having an easy world. It is about refusing to let a hard world stop you. Earth had tried to kill humanity for millions of years and had failed. A few assassination attempts by overconfident students did not even register on the scale of things humans had survived. Somewhere in the administrative offices, a file was updated. Earth status changed from developing world to death world integration case study. The classification would stick, and in the cafeteria they kept stocking capsaicin, just in case the humans wanted to feel at home. The galaxy, it turned out, was not ready for humanity. But ready or not, humans had arrived, and they had brought their survival instincts with them. The Thorn-Weave Trio's mistake had not been underestimating one human. It had been underestimating what it took to produce a species capable of reaching for the stars from a world that spent every day trying to teach them that reaching was fatal. Humans had learned the lesson. They had just learned a different version. Reach anyway. And that, more than any weapon or warship or technological advantage, was what made them dangerous. Not malice, not aggression, just the simple stubborn refusal to accept that something could not be done. The collective would adapt. They always did. But they would do so knowing that somewhere in the galaxy there was a world that made hell look like a vacation resort, and the beings who evolved there called it home.